Yes, I get that. Yes, Erin, I understand. But one thing that I wanted to say is I just share the desktop with everyone. All right. So one thing I wanted to say is that your activity has to have a purpose. Now, I spent pretty long time in this unit. This is I think module 3 now, and I spent a long time trying to say that people don't read, right? People don't do anything in terms of literacy. People don't do, okay? People don't do anything. People do things in order to achieve goals, right? In order to achieve goals. This is extremely important. I cannot stress it enough. I can tell you that I have read 1,000 of articles, maybe not 1,000, but many articles published where people say, where people actually say what they will do in the research paper, but they don't actually say why. And therefore the whole framing of the paper goes wrong. I have seen PhD theses when students actually, and other research, smaller research papers where people say, oh, I will be learning about how people acquire sounds. Really? Why? Because sounds like a good idea. Well, it could be. So why would you want to learn how people acquire sounds? Because it's a prerequisite to writing. Really? Can you find now literature that documents it? And then say to us how important are the arguments that you have found. And in order to actually identify how important it is, you have to come up with different empirical evidences from different maybe fields to actually show, oh, look at this, when this happens, this happens, when this happens, this happens, right? And this is where it all breaks down, because people create objects of research based on what they feel like, what they heard, what they think it's right? But when you actually write the purpose, and now you have to connect and make a connection, well, in order to achieve this, I do this. Really connect it. And then it's really hard, because people say, oh, maybe acquisition of sounds has nothing to do with reading and writing. Or maybe you don't acquire sounds. How about that idea? Oh my goodness, right? So what I'm saying is, it's not about reading recipes. It is we're learning to cook, and for that we're learning to read recipes. So what I want to do is talk to you how I read with my children recipes so that they can actually learn to cook. So now what you will be doing is evaluating your activity of how you go about reading with your child, say whatever it is, in order to achieve the goal of learning to cook. And then you will come up with questions, questions that the activity, that the curriculum will be asking you, things like, what's the relationship between cooking and actually being part of a society, smaller, greater? Has that actually transforming the child, transforming their contribution to their surroundings? What kind of materials did you consider to actually explore with a child so that they can actually learn to cook, maybe by reading recipes? What kind of materials? Well, I use Aboriginal recipes, so that's fantastic. But what kind of materials are you using to convince them that it's worthwhile to explore or even understand Aboriginal recipes? What do you mean understand? Well, if I take you to Poland and I give you Polish food, you will go yuck, right? Quite likely. I mean, not always, but quite likely. But not until you actually understand. And people who are actually very good cooks, they understand the history of a place. They understand the history of a soil. They understand the kind of constraints, the geographical constraints that apply in a particular area. That's why people eat this, not something else. That's why people find this tasteful, but not something else, right? So now a recipe is not a recipe. Recipe, it's like the word love. You can say it, but if you say to me, Ania, I love you, it's kind of weird because you don't even know me. But when you say it to your mother or to your husband, there's the entire landscape of history and experiences and feelings and activities that actually gives it meaning. So reading a recipe, it's nothing. It's like I just spoke to my PhD students today. What do you call? I can't pronounce this, and I don't know how to pronounce this word because I don't ever use it. But it's they very big people in education research like Biesta or Gary Thomas are very critical of research in education. What they say that everybody is actually not everybody, obviously not everybody, like 90% of research in education is actually removing from children their history, what they are in the society, and treating them like eunuchs of theory, right? You have your objects of someone's figment of imagination that they call theory. So teaching children recipes is like teaching children commas, right? Important or not, today we're going to spend 3 weeks learning about commas. Well, maybe you could do it differently. Maybe there is something about comma, but if you actually study it if you study it in depth, you could actually learn that comma can be learned in a much easier way without turning it into a tragedy, and you turn it into a tragedy when comma is what's called there's a beautiful word in English which is called reified from the context of its existence, which is removed and turned into a skeleton. So a recipe is like a skeleton, doesn't have a meaning, right? But a cake, what's the meaning of cake? Obviously a recipe of a cake is not the cake. The cake is what? The birthday, the afternoon tea, the binging moment when the life goes astray, right? That's the meaning of a cake. The pleasure, the afternoon tea with your friends, right? There's a whole history what cake means in the Western culture or in the European culture. I don't know what cake means in other cultures, so I can't talk about it. I know that in Asian cultures there's no such a thing like cake. They do other things. So, and for me to understand why they do what they do, I would have to be a little bit engaged in their history and so on. So no, it's not about describing and analyzing how we read recipe together. It's about how we read recipes, in how we read recipes, not that we read recipes, but how we read recipes for my child to learn how to cook. And how to cook, it's not just getting the cake right, because you can get it right and you presented it to my Asian PhD students and many of them will say, well, that was lovely, but since they have no culture of afternoon tea in the sense as we do, or maybe of some other tastes and some other sort of background, a cake is nothing. But for people from the Western culture or European culture, cake is like there's a whole ceremony of cake serving, cake appearances, different cakes for different occasions. For an afternoon tea, you give people a fruit cake. I don't know about your country, but Australia, but I've lived here longer than I've lived in Poland, but I was raised in Poland, so I kind of understand it differently. So in Poland, you would, for an afternoon tea, you would give people a thing with more, we call it cakes, right? But it's like a fruit cake, but it's not a fruit cake in an Australian sort of way. But you don't really eat a tort for an afternoon tea in Poland, for example, but you do eat tort for your birthday, which is like a very creamy, very rich cake. So you learn all of that, and then you learn about why particular fruits, so there's the whole, so in order to know how to cook, and then what does it mean to know how to cook? It means to understand cooking. Do you think that a recipe is a good idea absolutely, and this is what I wanted to spend time today on, just how to tackle this particular aspect of assignment 2. I don't want to make you hysterical about it. I don't want you to panic about it. I'll just take you through steps. I think I've done the podcast before Easter, so I hope that some of you have gone through it, and I'll take you through some aspects of it today. But we will be working with it a little bit more thoroughly for assignment 2. So this is just an introduction, right? So that I can actually see in your assignments particular elements that are necessary for reading the curriculum from my perspective. If you go to another teacher or lecturer, pardon me, might teach you a different way of reading the curriculum, and that's fine. You and you go to school and you will see particular ways, and what you may need to actually design for yourself once you are a teacher is the best way that allows you to actually meet the requirements of a school and of EITL. Now, the requirements of EITL should not be read in a simple way, because they're not simple. And as much as EITL, very often people say that EITL is prescriptive, I'll tell you one thing. I don't think so, it's prescriptive, but I also think that if you want to be a senior teacher, if you want to be a leader teacher, if you want to be an innovative teacher, which is all the kinds of things you need to demonstrate in order to get your pay rise, and I don't know how it's in Victoria or anywhere else, but if I had my life back, once again, I would become a teacher in the Northern Territory. If I get $135,000 after teaching for so many years and actually showing that I'm a senior teacher, and then as a principal I get just about $300,000, trust me, by the time I'm hitting 35, I'll try to be a principal. So it's really worthwhile to engage critically in your practice, because when you do, you can work with other people and actually work together towards getting promotion, towards actually building this future of our schooling, and getting paid for it, right? Which is a wonderful thing. And the money is real. The table from last collaborative session, you said we could use, absolutely. I prefer it. Yeah. If so, how would you like us to reference? Oh, don't worry. Just say that you follow you don't reference it. You basically use the table. If you want to reference it, you can say that, you know, we're using Ania Lian's. We pronounce my name Lian, right? Lian. So my family pronounces it as Lian. Never mind. So they were foreign. I mean, my husband's family obviously was not from Australia. He was born in Alexandria in Egypt. His mother was Greek. His father was everything. Lebanese, I think, and British. But, you know, I don't know. They spoke French. And when they came to Australia, they read Lian, and they were lawyers. So Lian makes lion, clearly, right? And we became lions, orally at least, but on writing, of course, it's Lian. Anyway, so you can just say, as per Ania Lian's instructions. So that's fine. So I prefer a table. I'll show you why. This is this exquisite assignment by, well, anyway, it's by Laura. So it's actually very good. But when I look at her description of activity, and I haven't read it really. I just browsed through it. I just skimmed through it. It's really hard for me. I will read it, and I will give justice to this description. But I prefer to see it all in a table, because I can see what's missing and what's present. Here, I have to actually create mentally my own table. And the danger is that I might miss some things, right? So the danger when the website is presented badly, when the text doesn't have references, when there are no tables, there is always a risk that I might misread it. You must understand I have 170 assignments to do, so the clearer you lay out things, the better for me, because you're actually writing for me, dare I say, right? So that I can actually see the bits and pieces. So this is pretty nicely, there's an attempt to do it quite nicely, so you can see that she tried to actually create contrast here, so I could tell things apart. So that helps, but I still would have preferred one activity for what described in order to actually achieve a particular purpose, and a table. It's always easier. And for your future, when you will be designing your units of work for your class, you have to do it in the table. Otherwise, it's just too complicated to get it. So where were we? Okay. All right, so let us think a little bit, okay? Everybody ready to actually study now to say how we will work with assignment 1 with the activity? Everybody ready for it to actually assess? We're happy? All right, so here we go. So as you said, as you recall, I always say the following. This is my way of reading the Australian curriculum, and the same for early years framework, but I will stick to the Australian curriculum at this very moment and later on again to early years framework. Capabilities are extremely important. Such is the case at school. It is also becoming and belonging in early years framework, and at the university you have graduate attributes, right? My university is not interested whether you know where the comma is and where there isn't a comma. They like it, but they like your knowledge of comma or of something else to be integrated in something bit bigger, like for example ability to communicate. There's no point of you knowing where to put commas when you cannot actually express yourself coherently, right? You get it? So the same is with schools. Nobody cares whether students can actually perform. I mean, look, nobody cares. What I mean by that, there are different ways in which people will look at content depending on their framework. But the way I read the curriculum and the aids or requirements, it's as follows, right? Nobody cares whether your students can understand where commas fall or where period, or that the students should start a sentence with a capital letter. That's lovely, but you can teach almost a dog to do that, right? You can say comma and he will lie down, or whatever you say, period, and he will do something else, right? So that's not what's of interest to schools. What schools want is students to be capable participants across different contexts of engagement, of social engagement, right? So let's call it simply communication, but capable participants across different contexts of engagement, of social engagement. So this is what it means: participate, communicate, be capable person. That's what they want. So what we teach, this is why I'm saying that the curriculum should be taught as the following sentence. We teach capabilities in the context of activities, and we use content as an excuse, as a reference guide that we engage in order to achieve capabilities in the framework of the activities that engage those priorities, right? So we teach capabilities in the context of priorities, and we use content as a reference point that we engage in order to achieve capabilities, not in order to achieve content. So why did I repeat it? Because what we will be looking at is, when we look at the Australian curriculum, we will first have to have a page ready that has what we will need is an understanding what capabilities are, right? So we need understanding what capabilities are. We need also to keep in mind that there are things like Indigenous, Asian, community orientation, and sustainability. So that's a kind of greater context that they exist. And we also have to know the content. So there are these three things that we need to address whenever we plan our curriculum or our teaching, and also when we assess. When we assess ourselves, we assess how well do we do with those capabilities. So when you actually assess your literacy activity, you need to assess how well you actually achieve the capabilities described in the curriculum, or the being, belonging, and becoming. So that's what you assess. And then in order to create a story, you will tell me how the Indigenous and Asian and community building and sustainability factors are part of it. And also, then you will refer into content and see and tell me a story, how this content helps you to guide you in your objective to achieve capabilities. So let's look at the recipe, right? Let's look at the recipe. So where was I gonna look? So first of all, we need the curriculum. So where do I have curriculum? I've got the curriculum open somewhere. So we've got this curriculum here with all these descriptors, right? So that's really lovely. So we have language, literature, I'll close it. And then we have literacy. So I think that's lovely. It really doesn't matter what year you will work with because they're approximately the same. They just what changes is the sophistication, but the aspects are the same. That sophistication changes. So language, blah blah blah. So we had this framework here. Forget that for a moment. So what we will do, we have this table organized now. You can draw it yourself. It's quite easy. I didn't produce it in a drawing, but you can draw it yourself. So you can draw it yourself. So you've got these 3 capabilities here. You've got 3 strands of relevant to English. And then you have all these things. In literacy, you have particular content. In language, you have particular content. And in English, you have particular content. I suggested that we start with personal and social capabilities. The reason for it is it doesn't matter whether it's literature or language, doesn't matter. So we start with your assessment basically with personal and social capabilities because you need to somehow see the whole, you need to identify the needs of your purpose, right? So you don't identify how you teach recipes, you identify how well you achieve the purpose for which you teach, for which you read together recipes. So what's the purpose of it? I mean, you as a mother, when you read with a child recipes, you have a purpose for it. It could be so that he can, in an interesting activity, start sort of getting acquainted with letters. So it could be, so in order to introduce him or her, the child or children, to the very concept that letters actually in the text have a possibility to be read and then engaged in a practical activity like actually cooking of sorts, right? So so that's why it's very important that you define the purpose. So the purpose, but I'm just not gonna go with letters and whatever because I'm not prepared for it. I'm better prepared for something like, in this assignment, I will evaluate my activity of reading with my child recipes for the purpose of teaching the child how to cook from recipes. Okay, how to use recipes to cook from it. Okay, because it's not simple. It's not simple. When I had a boyfriend, and I was probably by then not real boyfriend, just friend, male friend. I was maybe 16, 17. We tried to cook something in a communist Poland and nothing turned out from it. We had to throw it out into the toilet because the recipe didn't say all the things in between, but had to happen. But it was assumed, and I was really worried because that my mother will be screaming at me because here when you buy milk or eggs, no problem. But in the communist Poland, it was like you had to stand for 2 days to get some eggs, and all of that went to the rubbish bin. So the recipe is not a simple thing, right? So that's how I learned. It's not a simple thing. So we're reading a recipe in order to learn how to cook. Well, that's wonderful. What does the activity of learning to cook actually involve? So the question, so I produced this PowerPoint and it is in your module. Now I'm no longer swearing by this PowerPoint, right? It was there and then created. You have it. I think it's this one here. Sorry, everything got selected. This one at the end, okay? It's called lecture 02, so lecture 2B. So you have it. And so we have it here, and I just want to make it larger. All right. So you need to now actually get the vision. So the social and personal capabilities actually ask you a question: how is this activity to impact on the way how your child or your student or your whoever or you yourself, how you perceive your self-efficacy, yourself, how you perceive, how it's gonna be transformative for you as a person, and how is it gonna change the way how other people view you. So that's the social sort of personal capability. Social personal capability is about how other people perceive your role, or start seeing you as, you know, growing and contributing to them. And personal is how you actually yourself see your own successes in growing, right? So personal and social. Now, I'm sure that the Australian curriculum has 3,000 pages on each of those capability, and they're just too long. And I think that it's much nicer to actually define them in a very neat, short way. Here in 2015, I called it relevance, which is, well, how is it relevant to you, or how is it relevant to your student, to your child, right? It's the relevance of it. So I talk about personal and social capabilities in terms of relevance, but never mind, that's just me. So if we were to describe the purpose of I'm cooking in order I'm reading with my child a recipe in order for my child to learn how to cook from recipes. So for example, in terms of so let's describe it now. How does your engagement with literacy tools impact, so in terms of language, because we have language literacy, language literature and literacy, right? So it's probably best to start with literature, but I'm just here having language, so let's look at it. How does your engagement with literacy tools impact on your understanding of yourself in the community and others? Okay, so I'm learning how to cook, and I'm reading recipes in order to learn how, so I'm reading with my child recipes so that he learns or she learns to cook from recipes. Now what you're asking me to assess is as follows. Cooking from the recipe is not just cooking from the recipe. There's something else involved, right? Well, clearly, right? It's called culture, right? Kind of a chimpanzee has a sophisticated culture, but you haven't seen them yet preparing a birthday cake, right? So there's clearly, even a recipe is about acculturation of your child. So we could actually make some assessments of it, how well we're doing this, right? So this is how we're gonna have a little bit of a critical think about it, just for the fun and for the assignment. Just for the fun of it and for the assignment. So how does the engagement with literacy tools impact on my child's understanding of him or herself in the community? And also of his or her understanding of others? How? Oh my God, I have no idea. We're doing just a bloody recipe, Ania. Right. So in terms of language, demonstrate in relation to the following dialects and forms of writing. What? Ania, we take a newspaper, get it? Get it, Ania? We take a newspaper, we read it, and we're doing this. Well, what's a dialect there? Ania, newspaper, get it? Means standard English. Oh, so you say that, you know? But language variation and change, you could say, first, what does language variation and change involve? Well, it involves being aware that language has, there are many Englishes and English changes. How's that for a definition? Pretty good. All right, so how does this relate to the way you teach reading recipes? Well, Anya, it doesn't. We just use standard English, and there is no variation and there is no change. Really? So can we tell me more? Nope. But you could, couldn't you? You could say to me, if you look a little bit to the left, because we will do it later on, but you could look to the left now and say, dialects. Hey, what could I be doing to use dialects? Well, maybe I could show to my child recipes written in different versions of English so that we could create a connection between what they cook and how they write and speak. Oh my God, we could, couldn't we? Language change. Oh, I hate that. All right, so we could look at recipes that maybe are written in Old English. We could, couldn't we? Oh my God. And then we could also develop an awareness from that as language changes, maybe things are named differently. And then maybe we don't no longer, there are some recipes that we don't even know what we're cooking because there are some words that we don't understand. Oh my God. All right. Well, that's getting interesting, right? Getting really interesting. Dialects, language change through time, use different forms of English. Like what? Well, like language changes, it changes its form. What else changes? Different way of writing. You remember there was Gothic writing, in English. English is a very young language. It's probably only about slightly over 1,000 years old. So, but it was based, at least partially, on the, it used to have actually this Gothic writing that nobody can actually read, nobody normal. Like, I have to tell you a story. I actually have my primary education, even though I'm Polish, I was educated as a German teacher. And one of the things at university we had to read was those novels in Gothic German. Oh my God, if you think this literacy unit is difficult, you should read a novel in Gothic. You would just bail out from the university in no time. Anyway, it would be interesting to have fun with a child trying to decipher, even with a little child, playing with those letters, right? So it's not just a reading recipe for to cook, to get this end product, there's nobody hiring us. We could actually play with those Gothic letters. And, maybe then you could also even expand to different other alphabets to ensure that the child actually starts integrating the idea in his or her head that there's more than one alphabet and more than one way of writing. Like, we haven't even started, and look at this, for 20 minutes we're talking about language variation and change in terms of recipe. All right, that's a headache. So what we wanted to do, so when we look at the personal and social capabilities, we're asking ourselves, what is it that we want in terms of our child learning about herself in the community and in community of others? And learning about herself in the community and also learning about others. So herself and also learning about others. That cooking is connected to the community. And my life is like this, but there are other communities, there are other ways of looking at food, writing about food, describing food using in terms of language variation and change. Okay, so that's the kind of thing. We want to make a connection with the writing, with the history, with the geography of food, and also with food across time. Okay, so that's that. Do I do it at home? No. But you can write about it, right? So I can see when you start doing this kind of exploration of the activity itself, then I can see that you started to actually think about the curriculum, because I am your teacher educator, which means I'm more interested in how you actually are starting to critically engage with the reading of the curriculum rather than you being a moral or immoral person. I don't really care. All right, so links between purpose, tools. I'm still reading the personal and social in terms of language for interaction. So we've done language variations. So now, so this is a planning thing, right? So what we wanted to do: how does your engagement with literacy tools impact on your understanding of on your child's understanding of himself in the community and of himself in terms of language for interactions? Purpose, tools, structure. Well, look, we lost a big linguist here in CDU, but recipe has a particular purpose. As a result, there are particular tools, and the recipe has a particular structure. That would be nice because you have particular expectations of recipe, right? You don't want there to be a poem, right? You have very clear, for clarity, you have structure that people know how many eggs. So if you cook and you don't remember how many eggs, or you don't know how much flour to put in, you know where to look for it, right? And the text is not ambiguous. So that's lovely. And then you also think so about the community and how they perceive themselves in the community. Well, it'd be interesting to say in here, language for interaction, that the community now, what the child is learning, that recipes come with particular structures, right? Particular structures and expectations as a result. Don't worry, we're just stuck with the personal and social still. So that's a kind of thing. So and the next one is, how does is text structure and organization? Why, right? Why there is this particular structure in the recipe? Well, we will never know per se. We will never know per se, but we basically can draw attention of a child to that. So that'd be lovely. How does it impact on his or her knowledge of himself and herself? Well, at this very moment, because we haven't done the critical and ethical yet, we kind of are aware that we want a child to know that our community has particular has used and uses particular language for particular structures and particular language forms across time and across different geographical areas, in order for, and it does it in such a way that the community itself has is very much in agreement. We have reached an agreement to a point about how a recipe is to look like, and particular tools it uses, like milligrams and I don't know how many amounts, so the particular ways in which we actually describe the things that matter for a recipe. And then the last one is links between clause, grammar, aesthetics, phoneme awareness. Yeah, it's very interesting. What type of sentences? So the community has reached an agreement as to the genre of a recipe, right? So the student now is developing a very much, if you're using here at this very moment a very much Australian recipe or Western recipe, then there's a very fixed structure, fixed forms, aesthetics, the clarity of it, what should be sticking out. You don't know much about aesthetics probably, but for now, I actually do cover aesthetics in assignment 2, but how things are grouped, how things are contrasted in a recipe, what things are sticking out. Is there so that what's basically the layout to make everything easier to be perceived. So what's sticking out, how things are grouped, how has the contrast between different bits of a structure maintained. So that would be aesthetics, phonemic awareness. So they put it in there so that children are actually becoming aware of sending out words and the text itself. But it's all very good. So this is what I would like. I want my child to be sort of a member of a community, learn how the community structures things, learn its tools, and learn that there is a history behind it, right? That we used to use different forms and and we still do. We have different Englishes and we used to have different forms of writing. Maybe recipe in the past used to look differently. That'd be really nice to have a look at, and so on. So that's all very nice, and about understanding of yourself. Well, you're becoming you're learning about creating order. So when the child is actually learning a recipe, the child is learning how to structure things. The only thing in life we're actually learning is basically how to structure things. Structuring things is the hardest thing that people are actually learning. Most people do not learn to structure things. I mean, or at least at the highest level. So when they're not taught, right? When not most people, but most people, when they are not taught, they find it really hard to structure things. And the text is sort of flowing, ongoing, but there's really hard to see the core of it and how other bits relate in it. So the child is learning exactly that, but it's learning in a European way, so to speak. Okay. But when we now look into the same categories in terms of, say, for example, range or even ethical intercultural capability, so in terms of range, it says to you, okay, so you've got all this English across time, right? So language variation and change. So do you produce recipes in English, but from different countries, or how do you relate that? No, this is about language variation and change. So in terms of range here, we're thinking now about the sorts of materials that we give to a child, so that the child develops a greater awareness, can discern between things, right? Can discern. So this is a kind of a mainstream recipe. This would be different Englishes. So basically they learn that there is a standard English and there are different forms of English. It's very hard to do accented in Indian English because the recipe is actually read. I mean, it's written, it's typed, so we don't do that. But the kinds of materials, so it's about showing different types of recipe from different regions and so on. We discussed that so that they can actually see that. But what also it's important here is to show this child maybe not just a recipe, and sensitizing the child to how recipe structure or how the language has changed across time in a recipe form, but also show to children. I just don't know whether, that's why I'm breaking it here, because I'm just not sure whether I'll do it in here. But what for critical and creative, what I really want to say is that sometimes it's very good, not sometimes, always it's very good, that even when you actually focus on reading recipe, is actually to show to child other text, to contrast how the recipe is recipe and the newspaper is a newspaper, right? So recipe is recipe and here's a novel. Recipe is a recipe and here's a poem. Also, thinly written, in a kind of different structure than a novel, but it's not a recipe. So when you actually, especially it would be good for links between purpose, tools, and structure. So for example, you can show the poem in a little book, like, I don't know, Australian poems or English poems, but you can pick Dr. Seuss or whatever, and you can actually look with a child what makes a recipe, and when a recipe is no longer a recipe, it is a poem. So if you take the thing of Dr. Seuss about the eggs and bacon or green eggs or whatever, it is about food, but it's not a recipe, right? So what happens now when the child is learning about the purpose, tools, and structure of language, but now you actually want to teach the genre aspects of it, so you still focus on language and on structure of a recipe, you compare it with other similar and less similar texts so that you get the meaning. So if I can bring it out now, an example from real life, you can't know what's blue unless you have seen green, yellow, and something else, right? You can't know who is good unless you've seen bad people. So that element of contrast is extremely important, because you can't learn about something without learning about other things, right? And then when you grow, what happens? You accumulate experiences, and then you know more. But you don't know more because you accumulated more. You learn more because you learn to discern better and better and better and better, right? So we don't learn by accumulating, we learn by reorganizing things so that their meaning systems are now richer. I'll just read your text, guys, because I talked to myself for 3 hours. I'll just read you. Could you do the table headings and then write the paragraph under it? I just feel that I can't fit as much in a table. Yeah, write a paragraph, absolutely. Yeah, organize it however it's the best for you, yes. You can also use small font, so that will be fine. Small font, because I can expand the only thing I hate is when students use black text, black font on blue background. I can't read it. I'm no longer 20. My vision is not the same, right? So even if it is just slightly worse, just black on blue looks really horrible. So that's what I don't like. But small font is great. But yeah, write paragraphs. Students wrote paragraphs in the past. You are also teaching your child how to order. You cannot just add the butter and eggs, and that's right, you teach them order. But when you order flour and get them, there is an order to things that you are helping your child to see. Order in important and impacts our everyday goings, is what you said. That's right. So order, that's right, there's a sequence. I agree with you, and that's what the curriculum wants you to do. So now we have had this chat together, right? So that if you want to teach genre, you need to the range of text in critical and creative. You have to show them that some different text, not just a recipe. Not, you don't have to, but when you will be in assignment 2, I will ask you to do that. But if you want to teach children a genre, what you need to do is teach them a genre through different genres, so that children can compare and contrast, and then evaluate better and discern for themselves better what makes a recipe. And it's really hard for us to see. That's what I tell how the child perceives things, right? Because you're no longer 3, or you're no longer 5 years old. I tell it to my PhD students. It's been a long time when I wrote my PhD. I can't even remember, right? So the way I judge my students, I warn them, sometimes I could be too harsh because I no longer remember how it felt when you were 20-something and you wrote your doctorate. I can't remember. I can't remember what little one understood. So the same with you now. You might think that it's your child and whatever, but it's really hard to be in the child's shoes. So when you do critical and creative and you want to teach them structure, order, and all of that, you can say to yourself, well, for critical and creative, what is the range of texts against which I enable my child to compare and contrast what order looks like? In Dr. Seuss, when he talks about, ordering eggs and, those green eggs and whatever, is there an order there? What does the order look like there? And what does the order look in the recipe? If we wanted to order, so you look at structural compare and contrast aspects of the text between 2 or 3 different genres, so that the range of materials against which child creates an understanding of what makes a recipe is great. You want the range to be great, right? Because you can't put it this way. I always say it to myself. It sounds really horrible, but I'll just give it to you because that's the vision I have. If you leave a child in an empty room, it's a child abuse. If you give a child only one text to look at all, every day, all day, what do you call it, right? It's an impoverished environment. So what you want to do when you teach them a recipe, you also show them well, not necessarily at home, but when you evaluate yourself in terms of range, you say, well, wouldn't it be nice if I did that? If I showed them also what Dr. Seuss looks like versus a recipe. If I show them how a story is organized versus a recipe. That would enable the child to actually discern better. Okay, I have that all the time in the translation class I work in. I have to stop and remember that to me a lot of things are just subconscious decisions, but to them these things are brand new concepts and almost unnatural. Exactly. And you know, it's a it's a problem that we all have when we have little bit beings in our care, because I have little beings who are 30 years old, you have little beings who are little age, you know, they have, you know, little, just the 5 6 whatever years old, and the gap is unbridgeable. It's really hard to understand. So compare and contrast a range of materials, and when you also compare and contrast, you use different texts for them to language for interaction, right? So recipes for interaction, but so is Dr. Seuss, different interaction, different tools, different structure. Right. So the text organization, again, you should use at least 2 or 3. I mean, if when you evaluate yourself, you can actually say, so when you work with a child and you teach them to read from the recipe, do you also teach them to look at the text organization of other texts, expressing and developing ideas? So here is, in terms of critical and creative, illustrate a variety of ways to express ideas through concepts such as clause, grammar, aesthetics. You could have a look with the child, what's the purpose of a recipe? To express, to put the idea across fast. 2 eggs, right? 2 eggs. But if I wrote to you an email and I wrote, yeah, thanks, 2 eggs, or Monday, right? So you'd be offended, right? You could have said, Ania, hi, Sue, right? That would be nice. Or something like, maybe we could put 2 eggs into this basket, right? That would be nice, Anya. Instead, you just, but in the recipe, you don't want it. So you can actually look with the child at different texts and actually through compare and contrast. Compare and contrast is a phrase that actually I and my mentor were using only in my eyes, but now a lot of people talk about it, but I still don't think that they actually use it very well. So in order to learn one thing, you have to look at different types of text in order to actually start comparing and contrasting, in order to create increasingly stricter rules or understandings of what rules apply in what context. So that's what critical and creative is about. It's about the range of sources. And the ethical and intercultural is, you talk still about the language variation in terms as we used so far, but now you ask yourself, what's the community like where your child is living? So you're doing the recipe, say, in a home in Brisbane, but Brisbane is not Brisbane anymore, right? Brisbane today is a very different Brisbane than Brisbane was, I don't know when. We always said that in a multicultural society, but now it is more visible, in a sense that, you know, the media talk about it. Everybody reminds you that, you know, there are people who have accents. There are people who were born somewhere else, and you know, that's why we have a coffee and pizza, and we have French pastry, and we have all kinds of things here. So what kind of recipes? So this is also about materials, but no longer from the perspective of different genres, texts coming from different genres. Here, it's about who has written them, or at least about what kinds of people are these texts. Do you include indigenous recipes? Do you include, your neighbor is Vietnamese, do you include Vietnamese recipes? And you can say, no, I don't. That's fine. But because, you know, it's maybe, you know, you just don't. Some of you might. So that's the question, you know, what kinds of recipes? Are they, so in terms of language and variation and ethical and intercultural, if you were using indigenous recipes. What do they look like? Are they translated into English in order to make them look like English? And I don't know how originally indigenous people actually construct recipes. I have no idea. I'm so far away. When we go to assignment 2, however, I will remind you that in your school, I don't know about Brisbane or Victoria, but in the Northern Territory, at least theoretically, you should have what's called an indigenous or cultural officer, and that person is actually a connection with indigenous people, and you can ask that person, right? Or that person can connect you with indigenous groups, and you can learn about what other texts you can bring in order for your child, when your child is to become a part of the community, so that the concept of the community that your child is actually creating as a result of your engagement at home is expansive, right? It's not just the people like me and my mom, and they could be, it might be that you are Aboriginal and you actually forget about all the other people, say Vietnamese and the Greeks and the Italians next door and so on. It works both ways. But in terms of the indigenous officer, they will tell you where to go, and they will show you some ways in which they actually present how to cook. And it might be a drawing. Wouldn't be fun? Wouldn't that be fun? So, language variation and change. It would be very so in terms of ethical interculture, you might actually want to have a look how books, say for Vietnamese cooking or for Greek cooking or for Aboriginal cooking, how they are presented. Are they now sort of anglicized, or are there any texts out there or on the internet that are actually yet preserving some kind of aspects of structure that look unfamiliar to us in some way? So that would be interesting to see whether the text that you engage actually reflect the spirit of the community in which we are living, right? Which is the multicultural, multilingual, and so on. So that's so much about the recipe, right? And then in terms of language. And then you can go to literacy, or whatever is the literature. So first you were looking at the language structure, and now you look at literature and context. How's your understanding of cultural? So I'm just first looking at the personal and social. Sorry, friends. So we've done language. Can we go to the next? Literature. So this is literature and context. How's your so I'm looking at personal and social. How's your understanding of cultural context relevant to your own text? Your understanding of cultural context relevant to your own text, literature and context. In what way are the experiences you have gathered and analyzed relevant to you as a person and a member of larger community? Okay, so by the way, as you can see, these red bits I got from here, right? So you've got this is your curriculum, and I've got all of these from here. Well, not only from here, but this is this. So you can actually get some of these explanations are very simple. So you want elaboration, all right? So you can get that. So these are sometimes very simple, but that's okay. They were never meant to be written in such a way so as to replace your literacy teacher from university, right? They are just for you, to guide you, to help you with ideas, right? This is not a list of things you must teach. These are ideas for you to against which you check what can you think of could be important to consider when evaluating your literacy activity. So just check whether you have any questions. No. So we have a similar sort of structure that as we had with language. So when I look at the personal and social, how does your engagement with literature, how does your child's engagement with literature text impact on his or her understanding of himself in the community and on his and her understanding of others? So literature and context. How is your understanding of cultural context relevant to your own text? I don't understand that, to tell you the truth. Allow you to develop an understanding of the cultural context, literature. Do you engage texts that allow you to develop an in-depth understanding of their context? Okay. So you study. So basically, the idea now is to position those, say, for example, in terms of a recipe, the text in relation to how is your understanding of cultural context? What's cultural context? Who I am and who are others. That's your cultural context. So when we look at text, they actually help us to understand more about what the people, or what the people with whom I share my practices, my goals, my values, what we actually what are the things that we do, what we have, right? So in our culture, people use recipes, people use them as understanding of culture, to communicate, to share practices and experiences about things that's important, for example, as in this case, learning to actually cook. In what way are the experiences you gathered and analyzed relevant to you as a person, as a member of a larger community? Right, so what's involved here? So what we need to also think here, that the range of text, or the kinds of text that we want, that would be desirable in this activity of reading recipes, that the things that we will expose the child to, which is generate experiences that are of value to our child. So what's the child doing as a result of exposure to these texts? What's the child doing? Is the child learn just cooking, or becoming increasingly aware that the child is participating in a cultural experience, in an experience that bonds the child with home, with what people at home do, with what others do, say the neighbors, the bigger, larger community, the friends? Are we cooking and inviting other people? Are these what goals do these texts serve to make me feel that I am part of something bigger than myself? Right? What goals do they serve? So now when we actually, so this is the sort of thing to think of. So what's the response to the recipe? The response is that I can participate in the house culture better, but I make daddy and mommy happy when I cook something. What else? That I can actually take some biscuits and bring it to the school. I can take some biscuits and bring it to the aged care center where, there are people who might actually enjoy it. So I've analyzed the text. I am able to engage in the practice. I understand so many aspects involved in that whole ceremony of, say, cooking something, cakes or something. But I don't do it in order to read the recipe, right? So the whole cooking and reading a recipe is not about reading the recipe. It is about learning to use those texts in order to see how through these texts and through the activity of cooking, I am increasingly more like the people around me, right? So I participate and I share. Sharing is an extremely important aspect, because by sharing, you actually engage in contract with the community. You become legitimized. I do for you, you will do for me, right? I will build on what you have brought to the community, and you hopefully will identify relevance in my activities so that you can share from me and build from on me. So cooking is not about cooking, and I think that's exactly wonderful. It was a wonderful beginning today, because we started with something as humble as recipe, and now we're saying it's not about learning to read the recipe. It's not about cooking. It's about learning about the culture where the recipe and its structure, right, come from. And now we're actually saying that actually cooking from recipes, again, not just about cooking. It's about becoming part of a household, becoming part of a greater community than my household, which is friends, parents, school, age care center, family, greater family, right? Neighbors, taking things somewhere and sharing. And learning that sharing itself is extremely important, because by sharing we legitimize ourselves as members of a community, and we know that today I gave you biscuits, tomorrow you can remember my name and maybe count on me, and I can count on you, right? We start putting ourselves on our name on the wall of a community. So this is the sort of objective. This is why I start with the social and personal, because this is this transformative aspect of the activity in terms of text, right? What are these texts actually to achieve for me as a member of a society? This is in terms of this aspect here. And then you can actually look in terms of range, and also again culture. Range, which is the things in the left column, and culture, the middle column. The left column will ask you whether you actually can generate, whether you have considered the provision of greater types of text in order for child again to differentiate. So maybe the same text you were using for the language, now you can differentiate how those different texts what these different texts actually do to the child. And then also in terms of ethical and intercultural, what you do look at is again whether the texts have this cultural dimension to them, whether you are just using Western text, English text, or whether you actually brought in some other culture, some other sort of overtones, some texts that actually are not just the texts that reflect the mainstream of your household, right? Because I don't know, I mean, our students here in this course, in this unit, will be from my household probably would have been French, Polish. Your household might be Aboriginal, or could be something else. But no matter what our household, it's important that the text we use actually take children, enable children to understand themselves in the household and also outside of the household, and therefore they have a range of experiences in order to discern, in order to actually create more meaningful selves. Allow you to develop an in-depth, so the text. Do you engage texts? I'm reading the critical and creative. Do you engage texts that allow you to develop an in-depth understanding of their cultural context? Curriculum is really, so again, you create a range so that you no longer look at language, but basically look at the culture of recipe itself, right? Culture of recipe, and then you range culture of novels, culture of poetry. Do you engage texts that allow you to respond, showing your ability to gather, connect, and evaluate information? So, right, if you have a range of texts, then you don't just analyze the language, but also you are able to you know how to appreciate a story, say like a Dr. Seuss story or some other story, versus how to appreciate a recipe. They do different things, right? So you learn how to appreciate recipe, and you don't dismiss it as a simple text. You just learn that the recipes do different things than say novels do. Allow you to respond, showing your ability to share feelings and thoughts about the events and characters in texts. Well, it's really hard about the sharing feelings and thoughts and events when it comes to recipe, but it is about learning the profoundness of recipe. And actually it's very interesting that the critical and creative, if you have a range of different texts, like say novels and poems, but now when you actually bridge it with ethical and intercultural, so what you have recipes from different cultures, from different places, that so those tags give you insights into those different places, cultures, and in that sense you can actually engage the child in a discussion about, in a insightful discussion about those differences between different places and different people that create those different recipes. And now also what we have is that that breadth of different types of text, and also of text written by people belonging to different places and different cultures. What it does, it enables the child in terms of the social and cultural and personal capabilities. It really allows children to bond not just within the household but also across. So when they actually do those cookies for the aged care center, they actually have, the moment they walk into the aged care center with those cookies, they actually have a thorough understanding that the cookie is not a cookie. It's different structures, different texts across different genres, and it's across different cultures, right? I mean, they go to the aged care center not with a cookie, but with an entire story about what this cookie is. So you can see this is very thorough reflection on the Australian curriculum, and very thorough in the sense that the way I teach you, it allows you to actually think of the activity and its purpose in multidimensional ways. So something like, if you ever were as a teacher to teach actually reading recipes, you can see how the experiences, and that will be in your assignment too, which some of you might actually do. First, you might assess yourself in a recipe cooking context. And then maybe for your assignment too, you will devise a resource for teaching recipes, right? Reading recipes. Because when you will be doing this, you will see how many things you need to consider in order to create a rich experience for the child, so that if you really will produce a unit of work whereby your children in your classroom will find it inspiring to cook something for say aged care center, so the moment they walk in with those cookies to an aged care center or something else, they will walk in with a full head of ideas, right? It will not be anymore only a cookie. And that's a big difference, and that's what the curriculum is telling us. It's telling us, do not think that you're making just a cookie or reading a recipe. Think of the recipe in so many different ways, in terms of language literacy and literature, and in terms of the capabilities, that you can actually create a rich environment, generating out of a simple activity a most educating space for children. So I've just read. So would that be like reading an indigenous picture book to young readers which depicts them spearfishing and allowing the children develop? Absolutely. All of these things are extremely important. So Erin, yes. So it's becoming a wholesome experience, right? So it's not, so you, a primitive teaching is like, here's the flour, they say take 2 flours, take 2 eggs, and take 2 pieces of sugar, put them together, there's a cookie, we've read the recipe, ticked off, right? It's done. But this is not what the curriculum says. The curriculum says make it wholesome, or otherwise what you have is just what the machine reading is producing. It doesn't really matter, because they, as I said, Erin, before, they more or less much of the muchness, they just increase in complexity, but they more or less say the same things. Yeah. So yeah, by all means, use the foundation level. Doesn't really matter. But you will also want to, it depends also on the activity, because if you have an activity of literacy that you actually are doing something for adults, you might actually have a look also at the descriptors maybe from the higher level, but it doesn't matter. Just pick anything. Doesn't matter. At this very moment, what I want is a little bit of a story. Okay, that's very nice, Erin. Okay, so I might finish for today since everybody checked out. So we might as well finish for today. And next week we will move towards assignment 2. No, we will do early years framework. We'll do early years framework, and then we will start moving to assignment 2. Okay, thank you too. Okay, bye.